Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to IDRC. I would like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we gather is the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation. My name is Arjan Haan. I'm the director of the Inclusive Economies program at IDRC, and it's my honor and my pleasure to welcome you all to IDRC for this meeting. There is translation available, and of course headsets are available for people who would like to use them. And I also want to inform people that this meeting will be recorded, will be made available on video later on. Today's panel is part of IDRC's Gender Speaker Series, which aims to create a space where thought leaders working towards gender equality can share their knowledge. At the heart of the series is the desire to share research on the importance of creating a more gender-equal world and to showcase IDRC's efforts to support gender equality globally. And of course, we also do that in line with Canada's Feminist International Assistance Policy, or the FIA. The Sustainable Development Goals have a mandate to leave no one behind. A cornerstone of this agenda, within SDG 5 in particular, with the bold commitment to achieve gender equality and empower all women and girls. In recent years, civil registration and vital statistic systems, short for CRVS, have been in the spotlight on global development agendas as a crucial tool for charting SDG progress and advancing the rights of women and children. Civil registration and civil status certificates give people proof of their legal identity, age, and social relationships. These vital documents enable people access to public services such as health, education, social protection, and to exercise their rights such as voting or claiming inheritance. CRVS systems are essential for measuring progress towards 67 Sustainable Development Indicators, covering 12 of the 17 SDGs. Our panel of experts today aims to build on ongoing efforts and initiatives to strengthen and ensure gender responsiveness in global CRVS systems. At this time, welcoming the panel, and to give the honor of doing that properly, it's my pleasure to introduce to you Montasser Kamal, who will serve as our moderator for this panel. Montasser is my dear colleague, the program leader at IDRC's Maternal and Child Health Program, which houses CRVS. This is funded by Global Affairs Canada and IDRC. CRVS, the Center of Excellence for CRVS, is a global knowledge hub on CRVS systems, facilitating access to information and expertise, including global standards, tools, research, evidence, and good practice. Thank you again for joining us. Thank you to the panel for joining us, and over to you, Montasser.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Arjan. It is my pleasure to welcome you all here today, this afternoon, for this with this distinguished panel we have on gender data and civil registration, the path to equality. We have a distinguished panel with whom I'll introduce in a moment, but I maybe want to start by giving, just kind of framing the discussion a little bit for today, for this panel. Many women and girls across the world are invisible. It's not because they don't exist, but it's because their presence is not registered, their marriages, their deaths are not registered. This prevents them from exercising their basic rights and puts them at risk of poverty, gender-based violence, and early marriage. But we are able to, we can, there are tools that exist to give women and girls visibility through effective CRVS systems, and this is what we're talking about here today. There is a significant impetus to better understand the barriers to implementing effective CRVS systems, particularly within the country's political and cultural context, as we will hear from our panelists today. The Center of Excellence for CRVS, housed here at IDRC, is helping close this knowledge gap by publishing a new knowledge brief series on gender and CRVS. And some of you may have been here at the Gender and CRVS, Pioneering Gender and CRVS conference we hosted here in February of last year. And this is kind of one of the grandchildren that is now registered, is this panel, to have this, to really advance on this field. The first knowledge brief from this series of briefs I mentioned was published in February this year. We have copies outside for those who are interested, and two of our panelists today authored papers in the brief, so and they will be referring to some of those points they put in those briefs. So now this brings me to our esteemed panel. It's my pleasure to introduce them to you one by one. We'll start by, on my right, Deirdre Appel. She's the program manager at Open Data Watch, a nonprofit based in Washington, D.C. that works to improve the use, quality, and openness of data to help achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. Deirdre manages the organization's gender statistics program activities, including the Knowledge Brief series on CRVS and gender with IDRC. She's actively involved in policy and advocacy work around more and better financing for development data and runs the organization's communications. Welcome, Deirdre. We also have, next to Deirdre is Sandile, Simelane, who's the technical specialist in the Population and Development branch at Technical Division at UNFPA in New York. Sandile is a member of a core team that is responsible for the advancement of UNFPA's work on CRVS, focusing on the assessment of completeness and quality of registration of birth, marriages, divorce, and deaths. And second, assessment of proximate determinants of under-registration of vital events, and finally, production of vital statistics from civil registration data. So that's a big job for 190 some countries. He also leads UNFPA's Youth Mixed Migration Project in West and Central Africa. Prior to joining the UN in 2017, he worked for Statistics South Africa for 12 years. Welcome, Sandile. And then last but not least, Eleanor Carey, who is my furthest right. She's the technical manager with Data2X, a technical and advocacy non-platform housed at the United Nations Foundations, dedicated to improving the quality, availability, and use of gender data to make a practical difference in the lives of women and girls worldwide. Eleanor coordinates technical work across the organization's thematic partnerships and programs, and before Data2X, Eleanor held roles in private and public sector management, including a 2-year ODI fellowship with Ghana Statistical Service. Welcome, Eleanor. So, now we will approach this conversation in terms of blocks, just to facilitate the discussion as well, and the presentation by the panelists. We're going to have kind of like 3 different blocks for this conversation. The first one will help us set the stage of the significance of CRVS systems, especially from a gender perspective, and then we'll move on to bring out some key challenges and gaps on gender in gender data, and our panelists will give us some examples on that, and then finally we'll discuss promising results and lessons learned. The picture is not all bleak. There are some hopes, there are some good examples, and we want you to hear those from our panelists, and we'll discuss them later in the discussion period, which will be after we finish those rounds of the interventions from the panelists. There will be a period for a discussion for you. So please raise any questions at that time during the discussion period. So now let's turn to our discussion, and I will be, kind of again, the first block is kind of like setting the stage, where we know that without gender equality, it will be impossible to achieve the SDGs. This is already a worry that we only have 10 years left to the end period for the SDGs. But we still don't have with certainty, we don't know with certainty how many women and girls are living on the planet. It is amazing. In 2019, we still don't have certainty in terms of those numbers and where they are. In this context, could you each, please, as our panelists, share with us why you think that sustainable, inclusive CRVS systems are critical for women and girls? And I think I'll start with Eleanor.
Sure. Thank you so much. Is my mic on? Oh, great, thank you. So I think CRVS systems matter for women and girls, and it's maybe important to caveat the conversation by saying that, of course, CRVS matters for everyone, right? It's one of the kind of great equalizing systems in that we need every birth, every marriage, every divorce, and every death to be registered and recorded. But for women and girls, there's sort of three important ways that CRVS systems particularly matter. The first is in relation to the rights and services that girls and women can access and enable through having key documentation. So, for example, if we think about birth certificates, marriage registration can be really key in combating early child marriage, which is something that, of course, particularly impacts girls. And the most recent estimates are that there are still 15 million girls in the world who are married before age 18. So it's still a huge issue. There's also recent research from Findex at the World Bank, for example, and they found that lack of legal ID was one of the key barriers for women in accessing financial services. So there's also an issue around accessing services there. The second way that CRVS and gender particularly interacts is that if you think about in many particularly low and middle income countries, but actually around the world, it's usually women who are registering the vital events of the whole family and of the wider community. So because they are registering other family members, they're really placed well to be allies in improving the CRVS system. And the third way is that CRVS is very crucial in making women and girls visible within our data systems. So first of all, they provide a monitoring mechanism for the CRVS system itself, helping to point out exactly which groups are not being registered, and so that we can start to build targeted interventions to try to reach those groups. The second way, though, is that CRVS really provides this basic population data that in many countries you're not really going to get any other way. So even in the best case scenario where census is happening every 10 years, you really need more frequent data as you're going through. And we need this data to be sex disaggregated, I think, to kind of drive new thinking on what policies need to be designed to serve the demographic makeup of the future. So, for example, where will we need more maternity hospitals? Where will we need more education services? What are we seeing women delay marriage, and what does that tell us about their expectations for participation in the labour force, for example? So there are so many different questions that we can start to get at with CRVS. And the last thing I'll say that in thinking about CRVS as part of the wider statistical system is that it really provides frequent and individual level data, which particularly in lower and middle income countries, which can often be reliant on household surveys, that's extremely important.
Thank you very much. Eleanor, you raised points, many really good, important points about efficiency, about the frequency, and about the use of CRVS systems for the benefit and with the participation of women. Deirdre, what are your thoughts on this?
Sure. Well, first off, thank you to Montasser and to the IDRC staff for putting this event on. It's nice to be back in Ottawa in May. Last time I was here, it was February, so that's quite nice. But in terms of why CRVS systems, inclusive ones, sustainable ones, why they matter for women and girls, I think there's two levels. There's the micro level, which Eleanor had talked about briefly in her earlier remarks on the individual benefits, being able to access services, right to vote, legal identity. But then there's also this macro level, and perhaps a bit less interesting in terms of the individual, but also still very important in terms of CRVS's impact on statistics, on policymaking, on broader development planning that has impacts later down the road for women and girls, in addition to some of those immediate individual benefits. So the SDGs, I'm sure everyone were quite aware of them. They specifically, SDGs 5 and gender equality require high quality data in order to measure and track progress towards some of those goals. The reality is, and Data2X has done a lot of work around filling gender data gaps, the reality is there's a dearth of data for women and girls across a range of goals. So there's a need to find current data to be able to fill gaps and improve policies and decision making. So I think it matters in the sense of being able to provide that data, specifically CRVS, for the gender-related SDG indicators. So Montasser, in his opening remarks, made a comment that there's 67 indicators that CRVS can be used for. Working off of that number, UN Women has identified 54 gender-relevant indicators within the SDGs. So part of the Knowledge Brief series and one of the papers Open Data Watch worked on was trying to look at that number and see how many of those indicators can use CRVS data to measure and track progress, whether it's on population, on cause of death, maternal mortality, birth registration, adolescent birth registration. All of this is provided from CRVS Systems. And you'll see on the screen here, we have a breakdown of the indicators with each goal and the gender relevant indicators within them, and then what portion of those can be benefited by CRVS data. And the idea here with some of this information and these remarks are that CRVS matters, of course, for the individual, but it's also a very critical foundation for providing data which can tell the stories about women and girls as well, and can provide the data for policy as well as for the individual benefits.
Thanks very much, Deirdre. With one statement, you connected the women all the way to the SDGs, to international and global goals. So that's a really very nice way of putting it. Sandile, what would you like to add?
Thank you, Montasser. Wow. And thank you, colleagues.
Merci, Montasser, et merci à mes collègues pour vos interventions. Alors moi, je voudrais commencer par dire qu'en plus des données qui ont été mentionnées, quant au...
There are three basic principles that govern CRVS, which make it even more important for understanding gender equality broadly and sustainable development in a big way. The first one is that CRVS, by design, is supposed to be a permanent record of the events. Secondly, it is supposed to be continuous, which means it has to cover the whole lifespan of individuals. And thirdly, it's supposed to be universal, meaning it has to capture all vital events and all segments of the population. Now, if we look closely at what this means, if I take the permanency and continuous nature of CRVS first, it basically means that CRVS can facilitate a live course recording of events. And when you disaggregate this data by age and sex, you are able to, one, assess the coverage of the system at different levels of life cycle, and also pinpoint areas, as my colleagues indicated, areas where you need to address to ensure gender equality. Now, when you look at the principle of universality, it aligns hand in hand with the principle of leave no one behind in the SDG or the Agenda 2030 development program. And what it also means is that you don't have to leave anyone in the system. So therein, gender equality is emphasized as an important facilitator of sustainable development. So in those principles, just looking at those principles, we can see that civil registration has an important role to ensure sustainable development. The second attribute of CRVS is that it enables real-time collection of data, and that is an important tool for promoting efficient government planning and effective use of resources. Thirdly, we should also look at CRVS within the entire national statistics system, again, as my colleague indicated. if we want to have a complete population and development data ecosystem that accounts for everyone, we have to consider developing population censuses, household surveys, as well as CRVS concurrently. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sandile. You talked about universality or universal coverage with CRVS systems. You also talked about continuity, having this on continuous basis, but also having this as part of the national systems and national plans. So now we come to our second kind of part of this, which is really talking about the challenges and gaps in implementing this or in carrying this through. If we look at the available data, we see there are big gaps still. One of the major gaps is the disaggregation of data on coverage that is not available for the entire population. So it is difficult to know where the women whose events are not registered are, who they are, and why events such as birth, marriage, deaths are not registered. So for this, I'll turn first to Deirdre. Would you please sort of how organizations contribute to bridging the gap for birth registration?
Sure. Well, I think to start off, that there's no doubt that there's a lack of data on CRVS in terms of what we need for it. Our current data sets are certainly limited by a lack of disaggregation, and one of the biggest ways to begin to even bridge gaps and increase registration is breaking down national averages of vital events by sex, by wealth, urban-rural divides, race and ethnicities, and other features that might result in social exclusion. The issue with this is that when you look at a lot of registration rates, particularly birth ones at a national level, you don't see many discrepancies between registration rates of boys and girls. But it's rather once you begin to dig deeper into the data, you begin to see where issues may lie. For example, infants that are least likely to have their births registered are those who come from young women, women under 19 years old, unmarried women, those who might have limited education, who live in poor or more rural areas, or are often from disadvantaged communities within the country. So again, these national averages will not necessarily show those issues right off the bat. And if we think of knowledge as being a prerequisite for action, the knowledge on CRVS registration and birth registration in particular is lacking. So the first step would be to improve the quality and the availability of the data. The second step would be, if say you have all the data you need and it's there, what next? Is it going to be solved? And is birth registration, universal coverage going to be, or universal registration going to be linked? And the other burden here is that even if you do have good data, there are discriminatory laws or policies that are still in place that can hinder registration of births. So for a few examples are in countries you might have policies for birth registration which require a father's name on the certificate, a father to be present when registering the birth of the child. In some countries, perhaps you might need a birth certificate of the parents. In other circumstances, you have a need to show that the child is born out of wedlock. So a lot of these certain laws and policies that can also disincentivize registration. Another example is around fees for registration of births. There are, in some countries, particularly a number in sub-Saharan Africa, there are fees that are imposed for the registration of the birth, for a late registration. There are even multiple visits that might be required of the mother or of the father, first to present all the documents and later 3 days or so to go back to pick up the documents. And if you think about, the life of a woman in some of these areas, there might be, a lot of other priorities that take precedent over the registration. And that's something to certainly think about when closing gaps on birth registration. I think the second step would be, once you have or I guess the third, once you have the data and you have the right policies or legal frameworks in place, there's also a lot of social norms that circulate registration, which also have to be addressed or at least understood if there's efforts to close birth registration gaps. So understanding these, I think, is certainly key. An example is in West Africa in particular, and for the Knowledge Brief series, we have a paper coming out, or a brief coming out in June that will have 4 papers, and one of the papers discusses all of the social norms surrounding birth registration, which you can be on the lookout for. But the paper discusses naming practices around birth registration. So even if there are the laws in place, the incentives in place, there are these social norms that also govern how a birth is registered. For example, in Guinea, you have a practice which is typical in certain communities to have 7 days after the birth until the name of the child is given. And after these 7 days, a baptism might occur, and that is when the name is given and a registration could occur. It's after the window of the time for registering the birth, and if the child doesn't make it through that week, there's also a birth and a death that go uncounted. So it's understanding these naming practices and how that might fit into policy. Ghana has combated this through a policy which allows for a birth to be registered and a name to be actually added afterwards. So that's one example. Another example is around power dynamics within households for registration. Even if legally you have a woman who can easily go register a birth, there are norms around perhaps who speaks with civil authorities, who is the one that might go to do it. So understanding this, of course, is important, as well as the role of religious ceremonies in these vital life events. They play a very big role for birth registration and how that might take precedent over a civil proceeding, but whether or not there is a legitimacy in the state if a religious ceremony takes place. The last step would be that there's a need to also incentivize and to increase awareness around the birth registration and recognize as an individual, as a family, as a mother, that this is important for yourself and your child, as opposed to something that the government and the state just needs. And this paper gets into a little bit about this with the focus groups, where the perceptions around birth registration are it's really not something that the individual needs, but rather it's an act of government, and you just check a box for that purpose. So just to wrap up, I certainly don't take these steps lightly. They're really tough feats to achieve in terms of policy and social norms. They're not easy things to overcome, and certainly require country capacity, financial, and political support to do so. So in terms of some of the work our organization is doing is around those 3 facets, and I'll touch upon them later.
Thank you very much. This was like a tour de force of birth registration, and which is really important for us to really understand how in each step of the way there are things that need to be in place, interventions that could happen, and also how the demand and supply side play or influence sort of birth registration. But now we go to Sandile to maybe speak to us. Many women have, especially adult women who are married, don't have access to their spousal rights because those marriages are not registered. Can you share something with us about marriage registration?
Thank you again, Montasser. I'll start by saying marriage registration is a critical doorway to legal rights for women and girls. A marriage certificate provides a legal proof for a marriage, for existence of a marriage, and it can be used by women to secure property and inheritance rights upon the death of their spouse, or in the event the marriage is dissolved through a divorce. Now, the protective attribute of marriage registration is particularly important in settings where traditions and customs, as Deirdre just indicated, promote patriarchal practices. A nice example can be learned from an article that was published by Data 2X, a story of Blessing, a woman in Kenya who was able to convince her husband to register their marriage. And 4 years down the line, unfortunately, the husband did pass away, and Blessing was able to protect the assets that they had accumulated with the husband, including land and financial assets, when the family was gunning for them because she, quote unquote, she didn't have a son. They only had daughters. So in those kinds of settings, a marriage certificate can be a game changer for the woman and her children. While at that, I think it's also important to emphasize the importance of divorce registration as well. A recent study has indicated that in Indonesia, only 24% of divorced women have a divorce certificate. And according to the country's laws, these women, even if they are heads of their households, they cannot qualify to get a family card, which grants them access to Social Security should their family be falling. I mean, should their family require such assistance. So from that perspective, it is important for CRVS Systems to ensure that all marriages are registered, and also all divorces are registered. Another dimension to highlight is that we have to acknowledge that under registration of marriage and divorces is a consequence of several, sometimes mutually reinforcing issues. One of them, in the case of many countries in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, is outdated laws that are not in line with the current situation. Many of the countries, for example, are still using colonial laws, which one did not recognize customary marriages, and by so doing, we are excluding a significant amount of marriages, and therefore women and their children who are married in those kind of arrangements from exercising their full rights, because of they are excluded from the protections that marriage is supposed to provide. And another issue that relates to that is that, again, in some of the countries, because of the lack of updating of current laws, in some of the countries, marriage registration is not compulsory, as opposed to death and birth registration. A recent study, for example, by the Economic Commission for Africa on the status of CRVS in Africa, which reviewed 39 countries, found that out of those countries, as high as 17 countries, divorce registration is not compulsory. 6 of those 39 countries, again, marriage registration is not compulsory. So again, those marriages, the couples that are involved in those marriages have their spousal rights in a way impacted should something happen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sandile. Well, after marriage comes death, but ultimately a woman dies, and according to the statistics, most deaths are not registered. What are the implications for women for having their deaths unregistered? We go to Eleanor.
Okay, so I get the happy topic talking about death. So one of the SDG indicators for Goal 17 is to reach 80% registration. So it's 100% for birth registration. The goal is 80% for death registration. But in many lower and middle income countries, we're really very, very far from this level of registration. And it's for a number of reasons, predominantly that the majority of deaths are happening outside of hospital settings. So really capturing the death is unlikely. And even inside hospital settings, poor record keeping and, low levels of capacity, even to record that the death itself happened, but also recording around causes of death, which would be particularly important. Some recent research in the MENA region, for example, found that women's death was much lower in terms of registration than men's, mostly due to patrilineal inheritance. So there's many, as Deirdre was alluding to, there's many social norms around death registration as well. So I think there's really two main strands of how improvements in this area could touch the lives of women and girls. The first one I think is the most obvious. It's the one that we're all thinking, which is that if we had really good, really high quality sex disaggregated data on causes of death, essentially we would know whether women and men, boys and girls, are dying from the same causes or from different causes. Maternal mortality, of course, is an issue that is particular to women, but it in itself is not well registered and not well recorded at the moment. But there are other questions as well. What types of cancers are women dying from and men dying from? Are girls more susceptible to respiratory diseases because they are they're experiencing poor air quality in the home where they're more likely to spend time? So I think filling these data gaps would hopefully help to kind of raise key policy debates about how to tackle some of the gendered causes of death. And, in many lower middle income countries, we're also starting to see women living for a longer amount of time, but at poor levels of health. So tracking that over time and the relationships with causes of death would be extremely helpful. As Sandile was mentioning, the death registration is the missing link, I think, between having marriage registration and being able to actualize your widowhood rights and have access to your inheritance rights as well. Of course, this needs to sit within an enabling legal environment, allowing women to hold property, access financial services, etc. So I'll leave it there for now.
Thanks very much, Eleanor, for bringing out these key challenges and the importance of addressing them. So even at death, it's important to have that registered because there are certain rights and obligations that come from that. We now move on to the final section of the the panel discussion, and that will be on really to just start talking about some promising results and lessons learned from what has happened in the past. As we said, it's not all bleak. There are some signs of hope. There is progress in a number of areas that is important to celebrate, document and celebrate and learn from it. So maybe with this round, we'll start with Sandile. If you could give us an example of some examples, elaborate on examples or lessons learned from your work on what, how to address these gaps or how some of these gaps are being addressed.
Thank you again. I have time permitting, three lessons to share with the esteemed group in this house. First is that we have learned that delayed birth registration, marriage under registration, and death under registration are important, but yet understudied factors that affect gender equality. Now we need to understand, first of all, we need, among other things to consider, we first need to understand the interdependence between under-registration of different vital events. A recent study, for example, in Indonesia has showed that out of all the children that are affected by child marriage is because they didn't get a birth, their births were not registered. So we need to understand if is this an issue that is isolated in that particular country or that particular region, or it's an issue that talks to many regions, and what are the implications for the life course of these girls. We also need to recognize that incentives and disincentives to register vital events across a life course matter a lot, but they also need to be understood within the socio-cultural, socio-economic and cultural context in which they operate, as it has been indicated. Existing evidence suggests that it is rural populations, it is poor populations, and it is people in humanitarian contexts that are most likely to be missed by vital registration systems. And out of those groups that I've just mentioned, we also know that women are disproportionately more represented. So that on its own has a huge gender dimension to it. A few examples. In China, the one-child policy and son preference evidence has shown that it incentivized families to delay female births. And there have been a number of articles published about missing girls in China, only to find that they do show up later in life. And the recent evidence shows that it's because of the situation in the country at that time. Particularly rural families were more inclined to delay the registration of female births. And of course, that has implications for how they access services, including health and health and schooling. An example relating to death registration can be pulled from studies from Morocco, which has shown that due to the patrilineal inheritance traditions in the country and the cost that is involved to travel from rural areas to the registration centers, rural families have been more inclined not to report deaths of females. And this has implications for health policy planning and programming. And it shows biased sex-biased mortality statistics. From the humanitarian context, evidence has shown that due to stringent requirement of supporting documentation to register vital events among refugees, Syrian refugees in Jordan, there are short-term and long-term consequences that these Syrian people will face. First, in the short term, there are structural barriers which disproportionately affect women as well. In the long term, we anticipate that should the conflict in the country get settled, the women who most likely will be widowed, when they go back home, they may experience a number of challenges in terms of inheriting or reclaiming back what belongs to them in terms of inheritance and other assets, because there might be misalignment between the certificates which they acquired abroad and what exists in the country. So all those things do have a long-term impact on gender equality. The second lesson that we have learned is that data quality assessment and estimation is critical for differentiating the registration artifacts and also differentiating from normal population dynamics. For these, to understand these factors in their entirety, we need additional sources of information, including household surveys and censuses, as well as some ethnographic evidence. On its part, UNFPA is advocating for inclusion of add-on questions on birth registration, death registration, as well as marriage registration in the 2020 round of censuses. On the marriage bit, we are working closely with Data 2X, also trying to influence the inclusion of those questions in DHS and MIGS. Particularly on marriage, we are interested in making sure that every country collects information on age at first marriage, the type of marriage, as well as the registration status. Type of marriage is important because, as I indicated a short while ago, in some countries, customary marriages are not registered because of the backlog in updating of the existing laws. So it would be important for us to understand how many women are affected by non-registration of their marriages because they are married in the customary regime. And so this data will help us to assess the coverage and the quality of registration of these vital events, and also help us to assess the proximate determinants and the consequences of under-registration or non-registration.
Thank you very much. Sorry, thank you very much, Sandile. This is very helpful. Lessons learned from the field, obviously. Eleanor, what would you like to add from Data 2X? Great. Lessons learned, best practice.
Absolutely. So I think what I'm about to do is a bit of a roundup of some of the things that we've heard already. But from our research, I think what we came away with, I was a co-author with a colleague of mine on one of the papers that Deirdre mentioned, is that essentially there's two families of interventions to try to help to fill these gaps. The first is centered on using the data that we have from the CRVS systems and other survey data to essentially identify exactly what the problem is and then try to craft solutions around that. So through using the use of existing CRVS data, we can understand which groups of girls and women are least likely to register and at least start to try to understand why. So there's also opportunities, I think, to learn from survey data around the drivers behind non-registration. And as Sandile was mentioning, DHS is really a critical source of information, and we're working hard to try to improve that. But the second group of activities is really focused on stimulating more registration. You know, at the end of the day, civil registration leads to the data and therefore to the vital statistics. And so if you want more data, you've got to stimulate the registration itself. So this includes a number of things, some of which we've heard about already, including lifting legal restrictions to registration for women, really taking kind of what we would call a human-centered design approach to the design of registration mechanisms. So for example, we've seen mobile registration for rural communities work quite well. And I think the starting point there needs to be really acknowledging the fact that, as I was saying kind of right back at the beginning, that women are key in terms of improving the overall registration levels within a country. And so if we're thinking about the amount of time that women have, the difficulty that they have in terms of their mobility and getting to where registration sites might be located, all of these things need to be taken into account. We've also seen trials of not only taking away the financial barrier to registration and late registration, but we've actually seen trials of financial incentives for registration. So in countries such as India, Nepal, and many Latin American countries where I suppose the context around social protection systems being quite developed, conditional cash transfer programs being quite developed in that context, we've seen that kind of intervention be very helpful in terms of raising registration rates. I think as well, one thing we haven't talked about very much today is around national identification systems, which are a little different to CRVS, but it's still related. And I think that there is a growing popularity around national IDs and probably some opportunities to piggyback a little bit in terms of raising registration rates across the board. The last thing I'll say, and I think that this is really key, and I think we've all touched upon it at some point today, is that there is a lot of work to be done with communities to explain the benefits of registration, but also to ensure that those benefits are actually accruing to women and girls. It's very hard to convince anybody to do anything if there's nothing in it for them. And so if girls and women are systematically being denied their rights around voting, around access to services, around their basic human rights, education, health, etc., it's going to be very hard to convince them to enter into this what should really be a reciprocal relationship. And so I think that the key to building sustainable and functioning CRVS systems is to really ensure that these benefits in terms of access to services, voice and resources really are accruing to women and girls, and we can't really expect improvements to the system unless that corresponding transparency and improvement to government service really comes with it.
Thanks very much, Eleanor. I think what you and Sandile have raised also is kind of like the rights framing, the human rights framing for all of this, and enabling people to exercise their rights and having the systems to deliver on those rights. Deirdre, I get the last word on this round.
Sure. So I think what you've heard a little bit throughout the presentation is this knowledge brief series that Open Data Watch has been supporting IDRC in putting forth in this year, and having one brief published in February and 2 more happening this year. And so they're covering topics that haven't been explored yet that Eleanor had mentioned before. One of the topics in brief 2 will be on linking CRVS systems with national ID systems and what some of the gender dimensions within that might be. So our organization kind of comes from a place not from on the ground programs, but rather knowledge creation, partnership building, and things like that. And I think what we're learning, and one of the lessons we're taking away from this partnership and project has been that CRVS systems are certainly not only a technical one and only something that should have folks in the room who are statisticians and those involved with data alone. Rather, we're seeing from these conversations there's really quite large dimensions of politics and gender embedded within them that require, I think, a group of experts in all of those areas, whether it's, you could even have an anthropologist in the room talking with a statistician or a head of a civil registrar in a country to try to, bring out these issues of social norms and gender experts on the barriers that women might face. Because what we're hearing is that, you think of CRVS and civil registration as perhaps a government function, but rather until you begin to unpack it, you see how many different dimensions there are within it. So I think that's a big lesson learned of bringing together different partners and experts and viewpoints on it for really successful interventions. And I know that sounds like a lot of sound bites and, lip service to partnerships and things like that, but I think there really are examples of where it works. Philippines and the Philippine Statistics Authority is a good example of a national statistical office in a country that has worked to increase registration within its country. And I think on the other side of it, on the program side, some of the lessons learned and success stories that have come out of the research and some of the briefs have been touched upon, but I'll reiterate a few. I think it's developing that educational and informational program and campaigns around registration, ensuring that there's, I think, a moving away from a centralized approach to registration and working with more local and community levels to try to incentivize, and again, removing fees and some of these other barriers to registration. And the last point is that there's also a need to improve the statistical analysis of the data from civil registration, and that's been something that has allowed for more insights to be gleaned once you have the better data there.
Thanks so much, Deirdre. I really packed a whole number of points in those few words. Talked about multidisciplinarity. So civil CRVS systems are not just about statisticians. It's really about a whole constellation of professions that play a key role in this. The second one is really about coordination and partnership. Again, civil CRVS systems are not just about the Ministry of Health or the Ministry of Justice. There are really a number of players in this field and international players as well, usually at the country level, and that's really important. We also kind of didn't say it specifically, but really the point about the community organizing. We keep talking about, sort of the role of women, to demand their rights, and so there is a point of where women need to be empowered in so they're not necessarily always readily empowered, but they need to be organized and empowered to demand their rights for registration of these vital events, but also to exercise that right. And then finally, you also talked about the use. So having good analysis, better data, better analysis, and the use of the data that is analyzed. or that is put forward for decision making and for policy making. So the panel packed so much, but into these last 45 minutes or so. But now is the time for the audience, for you to ask your questions and make your comments. Please be brief, and we have. You can ask the question in the language of your choice, English or French. But please keep brief, and we'll take rounds of questions to try to pack as much as possible in the next few minutes. And please, if you could say who you are.
For sure. Can you hear me okay? Okay. My name is Alejandra Vargas, and I work here at IDRC for the Governance and Justice team. So I really appreciate, Eleanor in particular, your comments about, we tend to think about data as being generated to benefit women, and I think you outlined greatly how women are actually data generators and they know what's happening in the community. I was wondering if you could share a few more examples, and you shared the mobile one from the experience of Latin America, but a few more examples of, it's not necessarily about expanding systems, but really how to make current systems for registration more kind of amenable to women. So including how to build trust when there's a lot of perception around corruption in systems where women go to register children, or things around mobility. So how can, registration systems meet kind of women where they are? So you have kind of more lessons on that process of improving existing systems and make them more efficient. That would be fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you. Other questions?
Hello, Edgar Rodriguez with IDRC, Governance and Justice. One question that I have as I was listening to all your interventions, and thank you very much for being here today. It makes me think about the type of research that we're undertaking, which we consider the life cycle of all the people. And you are actually doing that exactly. So my question has to do with what happens when countries, and I'm sure that some of the countries that work with CRVS discriminate against populations, ethnic minorities within their own countries, not to have their registration available. I mean, so it's I'm thinking particularly of a country like Myanmar, where the minorities, the Rohingyas, are not, and women and several other ethnic minorities are not allowed to register their birth. And therefore, that causes a chain effect. You mentioned Syria and Jordan. I'm not familiar with the situation there, but the chain effect that I'm talking about is if you don't have the registration, you don't have access to education, but you can push that further into the national registration system that you were talking about is connected to that because is the issue of citizenship. Do you belong or not in the country? And in many countries, like in Latin America, where I'm originally from, it's birth certificate. It actually tells you a lot about your life. But one thing that is clear is you have that citizenship by definition. But it's not the case in many other countries. So question to you about Myanmar or other countries in which citizenship is an issue. Of course, it affects women more than other genders. But in case of citizenship, I mean, for minorities, it's extremely important. I would like to have your thoughts on that.
Thank you very much.
Hello, Karine from Status of Women Canada. I'm just curious, I have a question. Are there any country where they use a kind of mixed method to collect these data? And I have in mind like birth, marriage, death, it's all stuff that are very often celebrated in a religious manner. So I'm wondering, are there any country where the religious authority collect data and do they do their road up to the national level? So how is it working?
So who would like to go first?
I'm happy to jump in on the first question that was posed around, I think, how do you work with what you have and improve existing systems or ensure that you're meeting the demand or making it easier. One example on it that has come up is pairing registration with immunization campaigns. And that's been really successful because you're piggybacking off of something that's being done already, that there is a demand for, and then you're really just showing up to promote registration within that context. And that's been an intervention that has been seen as being successful as well. In terms of the question around what happens when really the country is the enemy behind registration, I don't have a clear answer on that. It's really a challenging one, and it just even makes me think of, I'm from the U.S. and what we have going on right now in leading up to the 2020 census and adding questions to the census on if you are a U.S. citizen or not, and the ramifications around that and the fear of then targeting those communities. So not totally an answer, but rather just to say that I think this is something that transcends low income, middle income, high income, really all countries. And it's, I think, coming back to having those institutions, I think, in place that can perhaps, try to go against what the government might be doing in the U.S., the Supreme Court, things like that. But I'm not totally sure.
Thank you. Sandile?
Thanks. I will reflect on the second question on what happens when countries use the system to exclude certain groups in the population from registration. I'll start by saying we have to acknowledge that countries have a sovereign right to craft their laws in whatever way they deem fit for their situation. But at the same time, there are international standards that are out there to say this is how things should be done if sustainable development is to be achieved. So I think the best we can do as a research community, academia, civil society organization, is to generate knowledge products to say, hey, here is this country, it's doing A, B, C, D, but we know that the CRVS system is founded on three principles. It has to be a permanent collection of vital events. It has to be a continuous collection of those vital events covering the entire lifespan of people. And it has to be universal. We don't have to exclude any segments of the population. So I think it's incumbent on the research community, journalists and so forth, to generate that information to say, this is what we know CRVS systems should be achieving, but in country A, B, and C, this is what's happening. Also respecting their sovereign rights to craft laws the way they deem fit. The point here in our case is to highlight the importance or the impediment of progress towards gender equality. By and by, maybe that information can encourage those countries to do things the right way. Thank you.
So I have just a few small reflections on, I think, all of them. So in terms of the first question around how to make current systems more gender sensitive, there are a few examples in our paper around innovations around having women-only registrars on particular days, because for some women they felt that was, removed one of the barriers for women in terms of being in small and enclosed spaces, potentially with someone of the opposite sex. They also had, I believe this was in India, but I need to check. They also had particular days where it was women only. So again, it's trying to get over some of those cultural barriers around interacting with the opposite sex. The interesting thing about that example, though, was that they didn't actually see the type of rise in registration that they thought they would. And when they went back and tried to figure out why, they realized it was because their communications fell down a little bit. Nobody knew. They forgot to tell anyone that these services were available to them. So there is that key kind of last step in making sure that the communities that you're really trying to reach, first of all, are involved in crafting that intervention and then know about it. So that's the first thing. I mean, that's why also, though, I really like this principle around human-centered design, because it's context-specific. right? So what they will need in a particular, rural community in India will be very different to what might be needed, even in the US context, as Deirdre was saying, for particular communities. So I think approaching in that way and really working with the communities that you're targeting is an interesting way to try to get around some of those issues. In the question about minority registration, I think really gets to the crux of this issue, the fact that CRVS is inherently political. Any government service essentially is. And just to echo Sandile's point, I do think that's why the principle of universality is just so vitally important. But I think the other thing it raises for me is the importance of ensuring that CRVS sits within a wider statistical system so that you can triangulate with other data sources. So, for example, if you can pick up those minority groups through household surveys, for example, which, there's always going to be a level of uncertainty, particularly if those groups are persecuted in some way. They may not want to reveal that they are part of that group. But if there are other ways, even qualitative data, that you can get to try to at least establish that those groups do exist, and then looking at the CRVS data, if you're not seeing them there's clearly a problem. So I think even being able to establish that is happening is a huge step forward. Of course, as Sandile mentioned, always respecting the fact that countries will have particular contexts and particular legal systems. In terms of your question, Karine, the kind of different ways to approach, I'm not sure I have a great answer on that, but I do know, just speaking from my own context, I'm Irish by background, I know that up until a certain point, the church in Ireland was very involved in registration. So it is possible in certain countries, but I don't know if anyone else has a better answer for you.
Sounds like a good research question, yes. So we'll look into that. We are running out of time, unfortunately, but the panelists will be here for a little bit after the panel. You can come and ask your questions. This is all the time we have for the Q&A, unfortunately, but thank you everyone for adding to our conversation and raising really some important points for us to follow up on. Thank you, our panelists, Eleanor, Deirdre, and Sandile, for sharing your insights and experience today, and for coming to Ottawa to share this with our audience. So clearly we can see that effective CRVS systems are essential for gender equality. So gender equality cannot be achieved without strong CRVS systems, because it is about counting people, women being counted. The compelling examples that the panel has shared with us today show us that policies to be inclusive and impactful, that how policies can be inclusive and impactful, but how can also this be based on data that is considered for the whole population on the basis of strong CRVS systems. IDRC's Center of Excellence for CRVS Systems has been supporting the work to contribute to knowledge and capacity building on gender and CRVS, and we hope to take this further, and we will take it up further through our knowledge briefs. The next one will be released in our event at Women Deliver in June, in 3 weeks, so please stay tuned for that. But before I close, I want to bring Arjan back to close the session today. Thank you very much, our panelists.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for our panelists. This was very enriching. It clearly drives home, as Montasser said, the point about the importance of registration of data for achieving the SDGs, for achieving universality. And I think what this tells us, it confirms to us how important it is to bring researchers and practitioners together to develop this further. Of course, it's very complex. Of course, it's political. The questions that were raised were very important in that respect. But that's exactly why we do what we do. And I just want to thank you for contributing to that and for the partnership. I also want to acknowledge that the partnership with the institutions that we do this, proud to do so here at IDRC, of course, with Global Affairs Canada, with UNFPA, with Data 2X and Open Data Watch, the have seen the representatives here, of course. Thank you for the collaboration in this important work. As Montasser said, and thank you to Montasser for the slightly hushy voice, wonderful moderation of this event. Thank you for that. As Montasser said, please continue to engage with us on through the outputs that are being produced with our partners, the briefs through social media, through future meetings, and also if you will be at Women Delivering in Vancouver, please do check out the event that we're hosting with the same partners, Data 2X and Open Data Watch, an event in Vancouver on the 4th of June. On behalf of IDRC, thank you again for coming to. We're glad it was kind of almost spring in Ottawa, that we didn't make you suffer that much. Thank you so much for dedicating your time, and thank you everybody for joining us.